My name is Maksym, as Vasil introduced me, and I represent a lot of collective work done by the Center for Spatial Technologies, also by colleagues. Today I will show something that we are very anxious to share. It's something that will come out, as Vasil mentioned, the second year of this attack is coming very soon, on the 16th of March. And towards that day, we are preparing the results of our research that will be published on the website. And basically what I'm going to do today is to go through all of these findings and to share them in this very nice company of yours. And I will basically go through now through the structure of this presentation and the structure of materials that we prepared. And as I will speak, I'll talk a little bit about our work with testimonies, which is something that it kind of is at the core of this work. I'll share how we work with the witnesses and also how this work has been supported by visual materials, by 3D models. So that's kind of the big part of my presentation. And then as part of this work, we also collaborated a lot with academics, scholars, and experts who kind of surround me today, and they will also present their bits of contribution to this general project. So, as Vasily already said, on 16th of March 2022, the Russian Air Force conducted an air bombing of Mariupol Drama Theater, and in the lead up to this strike, the theater worked as a shelter, as a civilian shelter for thousands of civilians. The few minutes after the explosion, people were, those who managed to survive the explosion were kind of seen exiting the theater for the last time, as you will see on the footage above. The history of this particular place is such that we could never see the site of the crime. Very soon after, on the 28th of March, the Russian forces captured the city center where the theater is located, and they very quickly started to cover up the crime. So they started to fabricate evidence, tell lies about what actually happened, of course accusing Ukrainian side of a false flag operation, but also making things like this, which Svetlana will talk about, organizing concerts, basically surrounding the building with a scaffolding, and then bulldozing the specific part of the building that remained after the strike, where the explosion happened, bulldozing that to the ground. And what you see here are the phases that precede so-called reconstruction of the theater. So it's very hard to observe from the outside what's going on at this kind of, at the site, this schizophrenic reality of it, and to explode this black box of denial and obfuscation, we are working to assemble this archive that is meant to really support the testimonies of people who were in the theater. So very closely we worked with these people using this technique called saturated testimony. You will hear about it in a moment. And of course, our role in this process was to conduct these interviews with people, but also to support their testimony with materials of our spatial research. By that I mean all of these collected media that were carefully organized and put together by our researchers, and also the medium where they were all put together is really the space of the theater. So here you can see the witnesses, the walkthroughs through the theater. And even after this first video was made, there's been kind of news coming out. There's already first floor of the theater that the Russian forces there kind of raising as if nothing happened. So of course it's the whole attack and the whole operation of conducting this attack in a moment when the city is completely cut off from electricity, from internet, from all other forms of infrastructure is not accidental. We have this very kind of clearly communicative violence that at the same time is counting on the fact that it cannot be brought to accountability, as it was not brought to accountability in numerous other Russian wars before. But in this case, for us, it was very important to gather these people who, of course, as a result of the war, are now scattered all around Europe and Ukraine, to basically gather their voices and to bring them together through this process of digital reconstruction. So we originally identified 60 people who were in the theater or who were somehow witnesses of these events. And out of those people, a little bit less than half, 27, participated in in-depth interviews with the team. So during the in-depth interviews, we talked to witnesses, we asked them about their experience as they wanted to share them, and we asked only few spatial questions. We tried to understand where those people were, what kinds of things they saw. And based on this information, we invited 10 witnesses to participate in further sessions. Using this technique, this called situated testimony, it's a technique that is developed by our colleagues at Forensic Architecture. And this reconstruction process allows the survivors to walk through the virtual space and model different aspects of the building as they remember it. So you will see a couple of examples of that in a little bit. I'll just say that this is a process that is meant to facilitate recollection. Each witness recalled part of the events that they remembered, and this in the end basically assembled the model that you saw in the beginning that was spinning, where all of these models together combined, they kind of show our understanding of the events as per the witnesses. So here you can see the process of recording these witnesses in our offices in Berlin and Kyiv. The witnesses are surrounded by two people, by an interviewer and by a 3D modeler. And we are very, very much looking forward to publish these materials. We'll publish this on the 16th of March. We're extremely hopeful that they will be watched. For us, it's very important to make sure that this information that was passed to us by the witnesses of the event is out there and is present. I'll show you a little bit of how it works, just playing a short fragment.
Двоє діток, старший Артем, 7 років виповнилося, а менша Настя, їй виповнилося 3 роки.
Добре. А ваше місце?
А мы вот здесь расстелили этот штору. А у нас было кресло компьютерное, возле колонны оно у нас стояло.
Спинкою доверху, так? Чи...
Да. Ми потім взяли деталь з цього, з декорацій і поставили перед цією колоною, бо нам дуло з виходу.
Отут між цим?
Да. Просто у нас лежали діти, щоб їм не так дуло. А навпроти нас, у нас там було колони і стояли ці стульчики, ну не стульчики, а кресла для этого, в театрі, на которых сидять. Нам просто, щоб лягти, ми загороджували прохід, коли лягали. У нас тут не лишалося простору, щоб пройти.
So this is just an example of how this process works and how it's later collected into our videos that we are publishing. And here you can see examples of this space as we combined all the models of different witnesses. You can see the pianos that people positioned in slightly different locations, but in this way there's a polyphony of their voices. There's a little bit of a difference in terms of how they remember the space, but at the same time there's very clear convergence. We understand, for instance, from the testimonies that people were constantly hearing sounds of airplanes. They mention it extensively. We also have a lot of footage where we can hear them say that even the theater was blown up by an air bomb. And this space for us is very important. It's important because for the first time we kind of understood what we actually went through with these witnesses, what kinds of spaces we understand. It's very easy to, using these models, to dismiss Russian claims, of course, because according to Russian propaganda, probably some of you know that the claim was that people were held hostage and there was explosion that was brought into the theater. In any case, not only it's very easy to dismiss things like that with models like this, but we also understand which spaces in the theater were more active and what kinds of things were going on there. So in this particular case, we have basically a virtual model that collects in itself multiple stories. And if I look at different objects here, I understand which witnesses contributed these models, and we can go to those witnesses. And for us, it's also a very good and effective way to tell the story of the building. So in the end of each of these interviews, we have a spinning model of a theater where we say that this particular witness interview of whom you just watched contributed these models to our research. And we also add that together with the models that all of our witnesses produced, combined, they form really the basis of this study. And it's important for us because we can also, through this, understand a little bit of what the Russian air bombing destroyed, right? Here you saw the spinning model of things that people produced as kind of immediate objects that they interacted with while they were in the theater. And here you can see a superimposition of that model onto a photogrammetry that was produced by my colleague Mykola, where you can see the destroyed building, right? The destroyed building, where you can also see where was the epicenter of explosion and how it superimposes again with these kind of objects that people modeled during their interviews. It means that doesn't mean that they were there at the moment of explosion, of course, but it means that they were in these places during their time in the theater. So I'll talk a bit about models. In the very beginning of the work, we went to archives. We got these beautiful drawings of the theater, and we got the first model of the theater very quickly. We also produced a lot of photogrammetries, which are these kind of processes where you turn videos or sets of images into models. For instance, this is a photogrammetry that is kind of just very high resolution, so sometimes people ask us where these photographs come from. These models were very important for us because we used them in the course of situated testimonies. We also at some point realized that the Mariupol theater is built according to multiple use projects, so-called, where multiple theaters in Ukraine were built according to this project. And they actually look different on the facade, and the spaces inside are identical. So we went to, well, other than some small details of decor, we went to the theater in Poltava and we got these scans. On these scans, you can see the space of Poltava theater, and of course, it was very useful for us because sometimes our witnesses were just saying like, okay, I was here. They very clearly understood and read the space, and we also used these models sometimes during the situated testimonies. We also learned a lot about space from the witnesses. So here you can see the process where the witnesses, of course, interacting a lot with the screen and with the modeler, but here there's also a set of drawings that they're kind of interacting with, and sometimes they, of course, corrected us. Like, for instance, these are drawings made by the couple. He is an actor and she's a lighting engineer in the theater. And they knew the space very well. They worked almost 20 years in the theater, and they were telling us, sorry, this door is opening opposite direction. Not only they knew the space of the theater very well, they also understood the presence or non-presence of people in different spaces in the theater. So these drawings specifically have these sheets where we ask them to mark where were the people and how many, and also these are quite important for us to understand the space of the building. And as you could see in the video, we also always work not only with one type of media, not only with one witness, not only with combination of different witness testimonies, but in this case also photographs are located in the space of the theater hall, and then, of course, witnesses interact with the spatial models, as I mentioned. So, speaking about this photographs and about visual materials, we have collected over 1,000 different pictures and videos. They come from different phases of a theater's life. It's a historic building, so it starts from the time when it was constructed, and it stands in the very important historical location where the biggest church in Mariupol stood and so on. So I'll not go into details of that now. But of course, it was very important for us to work with this media, right? To kind of get as much as possible from the very limited amount of photographs and videos that we had, because you probably know Mariupol was under siege. It was very hard to transmit information from inside of the siege. There was no charge on anyone's phone. It's a miracle that some people made this media. And also, of course, they all had to go through filtration camps where the phones were screened, and either the Russian soldiers who were conducting this filtration deleted these important pieces of evidence, or people being fearful of filtration deleted them themselves. So in any case, it was very important for us to work with these things. And so here you can see media arranged in timelines. We kind of very carefully worked with everything that we gathered, and here you can see an example of how a photograph is being located against a 3D model. This is a process that was also conducted by the team, and we actually located almost all the media that we gathered in the first round of this work. It's also possible to locate videos, by the way. But even with videos, we then split them into frames, for instance. Sometimes you watch a video and something happens in one of the frames, you don't notice it. It's very important for us to, again, get as much as possible from the limited amount of information we can. Sometimes it's helpful to not just see each frame carefully, but it's important to see the panoramic image and to see what's going on in this particular place. For instance, it's much easier to count people, right? Like here you can kind of estimate what's going on or what kinds of processes are happening. So we also try to understand, this is the field kitchen, right? The place where people cooked food for almost 2,000 people. Here you can see different ways they cooked food, but and this is an example of how we work with these collections of media. But also you can see from these two panoramas quite well what happened, right? The field kitchen, where the volunteers cooked food, where there were these gatherings of people. I don't know if you can see well the image above. There's over 50 people on this image doing different things, preparing food, if for some reason on this particular image there's quite little people specifically inside the field kitchen, but there's a lot of people around. And below you can see the same location a little bit from another angle, where basically the place where the center of this image is under the rubble. So it's very important for us to work with everything we can get and to get as much as possible from this. And of course, in this case, I'm talking only about relationship between different images and how this kind of combination of images is much stronger than any individual image. But in the following video, it's going to be clear how that's also strengthened by a witness.
Польова кухня стояла чітко, от де от эта труба, що під нею хренячила якраз вода. Да, вот это она. Напротив трубы ставь ее. Вот где сливная труба красная. С крыши которая. Четко, только наоборот прицепом разверни. От полевки, начиная, оставь вместо метр, где-то полтора, наверное, метра. И заставь это все 800-литровыми здоровыми пластмассовыми этими бочками. 3 было. 3 бочки, дальше все мы закидали палетами деревянными. Чтобы не прострелили, чтобы осколки, и не видно нас было. Тут же война шла. Само с утра уже пацаны вставали в 5. Уже печка уже дымила. Истопники. Вот этот Саша и второго Игорь. Вот это они погибли там. И вот это все, весь вот этот этаж обрушился. И по вот это весь тротуар, все вот так вот. Не помню, какой день влепили сюда машину с водой. И тут очередь собралась, прикинь, людей, куча. Говорю, куда? Говорю, сейчас, не дай бог, говорю, увидеть столпотворение. Говорю, лупанут. Уже самолет, каждый день самолет летал. Бомбил постоянно.
Город со всех сторон горит.
Говорю, сейчас будет просто элементарный удар. Говорю, ляжем тут все. Говорю, они же бьют по людям. Что вы, говорю, творите?
Это самолетик летает.
This particular video was filmed on the 15th of March, and what's going on here is a field kitchen at the time of the sunset. So it's closer to evening when people are making lunch. And also one of the voices is saying that the city is burning from all sides. So when we worked with the witnesses and when we worked with the space of the theater, we asked questions that were focused, relatively focused spatially. We still heard a lot about destruction of the city. And this is something that we will address a little bit more later, but it's very important to say that through this specific location, through looking at it very carefully, we could understand a lot about environment around.
Уже ближний бой, близко к центру. С Калашникова перестрелка. Вот горит центральный рынок. Центральный рынок сбрасывает бомбы, по 3, по 4 бомбы каждый день. Начиная с 26 февраля, сегодня уже 16. Такое впечатление, что нас хотят оставить полностью без еды. Там в контейнерах много продуктов. Полчаса назад было второе попадание в мой дом. Хорошо, что не в мой подъезд.
So this is a video where you can see the kind of panoramic overview of the city in this particular moment. And this is 10:20, 15 minutes after the theater was attacked, right? You can even barely see the smoke coming out of the theater that is behind the church. So you can see the type of environment that Mariupol was in that particular instance. And this is important to speak here. I don't know how well you know what happened in Mariupol, whether you watched certain films or footage from there, but it's very important for us to understand that when we focus on the theater and what's going on there, we also gain a lot of insight on what's been going on around it. So during the interviews, sometimes we opened maps and we asked people to kind of draw certain lines. Where were they and how did they get into the theater? And one of our witnesses is actually has a very unique story because he came to the theater in the morning of March 16th. His friend was somewhere in Mariupol, he didn't know where, and he was very worried for him, so he decided to go in from Mangush, which is a city outside of Mariupol, kind of against all the people that are going in front of him. And his trajectory is extremely well documented. He considered it necessary to film every 3 minutes, and he filmed the small fragments of footage. And I'll play a little bit of his interview where you can see, first you can see a kind of his approach to Mariupol.
Блестят. Это колонна на Мариуполь. Вот это я еду уже вот так вот. Ну тут промежутки уже между машинами есть. Километров 5 уже вот такая очередь. Разорванные танки стоят. И вот еще один. Ну вот он Мариуполь. Развалины.
So and this is another piece of material where you can see the theater, you can see the map in front of you, and it's a little bit further on his trajectory.
Коротше, я їхав сюди прямо, в цій вулиці. Що не треба було робити? От. Це якраз дорога, яка вот эта дорога в Мордор. Точно. Как бы там был такой дым темный, что чем дальше я ехал, тем обзора вообще не было никакого. Я не знал, что там будет дальше вообще. Ну да, как бы я туда насквозь туда поехал. А когда я заехал под вот этот дым, ну там как бы темновато было очень, начали еще свистеть эти мины.
Там горит. Что-то горит. Больница, роддом.
This is the maternity hospital that was also air bombed a few days before the theater. And again, it's very important for us to show the scale of this and to, even within the story about the theater, which is located here to kind of to map these urban trajectories. And it's of course not the only example. When we have done that, there were a few witnesses who left the theater and decided to come back. I'm coming finally to the time when I'll share the floor with my colleagues, and I'll start from saying that within this work we produced two reports together with one of them was made by Garrett Collett, who's a defense consultant, and his materials are very important for us to understand the explosion, important to make assumptions about what kinds of air bombs were used in this particular case. So this will be also published on the website, and you'll be able to read it on the 16th of March. And the other one, which Isabel will speak a little bit about, is the legal assessment by ECCHR.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today and for the warm welcome. It's a pleasure to join this panel and the launch of this exceptional project. So first of all, congratulations to Maksym and colleagues at the Center for Spatial Technologies. As you mentioned, I'm speaking here today as a legal advisor at the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, a Berlin-based human rights organization that is using legal means to counter impunity for grave human rights violations worldwide. The focus of my work lies on international crimes and accountability, particularly for crimes committed in the war of aggression against Ukraine. And I'm very glad that as a team we were able to contribute a legal analysis of the airstrike on the Mariupol Drama Theater to this project. And the detailed analysis, as Maksym mentioned, will be uploaded on the website. So I'm here today to give you an overview of the outcomes of the assessment. I did not decide to make a presentation because I felt like I could not live up to the great visuals that we were going to see here today. But just to give you an idea of what I will be speaking about in the following presentation, I would first like to say a few general words about the highly problematic legal framework for airstrikes affecting civilians during armed conflicts. I will then give a summary of our main findings with regard to the attack on the theater. And finally, I would like to speak about steps we are taking at ECCHR towards accountability for the international crimes committed in Mariupol. So to start out, I believe that a few critical remarks on the regulation of airstrikes harming civilians in general are necessary. And the conduct during armed conflict is generally regulated in international humanitarian law, which foresees which conduct is permissible, and then in international criminal law, which foresees individual responsibility for certain very grave breaches of these norms that then constitute war crimes. And the idea of these norms generally is an attempt to humanize warfare, at least to a certain degree. For example, through the fundamental rule that the parties to an armed conflict may not intentionally direct attacks against civilians or civilian objects, namely objects that are not making an effective contribution to military action. And such a direct attack against civilians then constitutes a war crime if the perpetrator knew that they were targeting civilians. And at the same time, and this is why I say humanization only to a certain degree, the underlying logic of the law is still that when the parties to an armed conflict are targeting combatants or military objectives, so-called civilian casualties, meaning harm to civilians or objects which serve civil purposes, are not generally prohibited. So to put it very bluntly, in principle, the current legal framework allows to harm civilians for military gains, at least to a certain degree. So airstrikes on military targets are therefore only prohibited if the harm to civilians can be expected to be excessive in relation to the military advantage anticipated, and the threshold for airstrikes to be considered a war crime is then even higher. So only if the commander conducting the airstrike could foresee that it would cause clearly excessive civilian harm does the commander commit a war crime by still conducting the airstrike. And therefore, in summary, prosecution for a war crime due to an airstrike is only possible if evidence shows that those ordering or executing an airstrike intentionally targeted civilians, or that they knew that a large number of civilians would be harmed in a strategically insignificant attack on a perceived military target. And this, of course, puts a very big emphasis on the perspective of the perpetrator. Hence, though many civilians have been harmed in airstrikes in conflicts all over the world, hardly any cases have been prosecuted for war crimes by airstrikes so far, let alone successfully. Though I have to mention that there's an important caveat to be made, because as some of you may know, the International Criminal Court just issued an arrest warrant concerning 2 Russian suspects a few days ago concerning airstrikes on electric infrastructure in Ukraine. And this is, of course, an important step. It remains to be seen how this goes forward, but still, I just want to highlight the exceptional nature of these arrest warrants. Now, on the airstrike on the Mariupol drama theater in detail, as we all know, the Russian war of aggression has been characterized by relentless airstrikes on civilians and civilian objects all over Ukraine. We just saw examples on the footage that Maksym showed us, and the airstrike on the Mariupol drama theater is one of the emblematic examples of this. And it is, according to our legal assessment, also an exceptionally clear-cut case which could already be prosecuted as a war crime under international criminal law as it stands at the moment. Now, the basis of our assessment was primarily the information gathered by the Center for Spatial Technologies, particularly through the 12 situated testimonies and the expert opinion on the explosion that Maksym mentioned. Moreover, we also reviewed open source information, for example, a very extensive report by Amnesty International that some might be familiar with, and also several very thorough press researches, which also commissioned or spoke to experts on the explosion. And based on this pool of information, there are some important premises for the legal assessment that I would like to briefly highlight before I go into the legal part. Now, all of the information which is currently available points towards a Russian airstrike, which was conducted with 1 or 2 500-kilogram bombs dropped from an airplane, causing the destruction of the theater. Experts questioned or assigned by Amnesty, Associated Press, BBC, and the Center for Spatial Technologies concur in the finding that based on the impact and scope of the destruction, this can be concluded. And as we heard from Maksym, by contrast, the claims raised by Russia that Ukrainian soldiers blew the theater up from within seems implausible. As there is no visible crater of an explosion, the bomb rather likely exploded between the roof and the stage. This is one of the outcomes of the experts' findings. And none of the witnesses reported that the military had set up their headquarters, let alone placed explosives of several hundred kilograms on or above the stage. And I mean, the natural reaction of people within the theater seeing this would have been to flee the theater, but nobody reported that anything of the kind happened. Then, secondly, the available information does also not hint at the presence of any significant amount of Ukrainian military or territorial defense forces in or around the theater at the time of the attack, or any use of the theater for military purposes, which could have turned it into a military target. Witnesses mentioned that there were daily deliveries of aid by individual soldiers, and that possibly up to 3 or 4 individual members of territorial defense may have slept in a theater occasionally. It is not clear whether they did so in the night of 15th to 16th, and no military presence otherwise was visible on satellite images around the theater. And then thirdly, hundreds of civilians were present at the theater and sheltering there. While numbers vary, the Center for Spatial Technologies has come to the conclusion that it was likely around about 1,000 people who were still there at the time. And the use of the shelter was, on the one hand, publicly known. It was posted on the internet frequently. And it was also visible even from above, even on satellite images. So anyone overflying the theater could clearly see that there was a field kitchen outside and also the signs saying children in front of the theater on both sides that I'm sure all of us have also seen on the media. Now, against this background, we considered overwhelmingly likely that the attack actually constituted a war crime by Russian forces, given that the explosive hit the theater very accurately above the stage on a day of good weather with no other structures around for approximately 100 meters. It is very likely that it was the chosen target. This is also the outcome of the expert reports. And the civilian nature of the building and the civilians present, as I mentioned, was also publicly known. So it is very likely that it was a war crime of intentionally targeting civilians and a civilian object. Now, even if the Russian military had wanted to target the few soldiers that were delivering aid or members of the territorial defense possibly present, the strike would still have been unlawful because they must have been aware that the civilian harm to be expected would be clearly excessive to any military advantage that they could expect. So they were dropping 1 or 2 500 kilograms bomb on a theater which was sheltering so many civilians. And this could only, if at all, have been justified if there was an extraordinarily high value military target. But this assumption seems absolutely unreasonable, and the claim of a perpetrator would therefore not be credible, because the Russian forces were obliged to conduct reconnaissance about the situation on the ground, and on this basis they must have been aware that the vast number of civilians was present and also that the theater was not used for military purposes. Now, and it should also be made entirely clear that simply terrorizing the civilian population is not a legitimate military aim. And on this basis, in any event, it would have constituted a war crime of a disproportionate attack. And finally, and this also ties in with Maksym has shown us about the relentless airstrikes that we saw on the rest of Mariupol, and the siege over months that we've also heard about. There are also strong indications that the attack could have been a crime against humanity. Now, this presupposes that it took place in the context of a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population in Mariupol. And this, in turn, means that a broad number of persons must have been affected, or that there were patterns of violations, of grave human rights violations, that would indicate a policy behind the attacks. And currently, it is, of course, difficult to evidence this, because, as we heard, Mariupol is still under occupation. But there are several reports, for example, by the UN Commission of Inquiry, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, and also Ukrainian and international non-governmental organizations that have started to gather evidence on this. And we believe that given the extent to which civilians in Mariupol have been and still are affected, this should be part of any investigation into the attack. And this leads me to the last part of my presentation, in which I would like to say a few words about the specific steps that ECCHR is taking towards accountability for the attack on the Mariupol Drama Theatre and for other crimes committed in Mariupol, because we are currently pursuing several cases. Now, generally speaking, when crimes are committed, the state on whose territory this happens is responsible to investigate and also to prosecute them. In the case of international crimes, namely war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and arguably also the crime of aggression, besides this, third states are also permitted to step in, and moreover, the International Criminal Court can take on cases if the state has acknowledged its jurisdiction. In the case of Ukraine, unfortunately, it has not yet become a member of the International Criminal Court, but it has acknowledged its jurisdiction ad hoc. And against this background, the ICC has already issued 4 arrest warrants, the 2 ones that I mentioned before, and also, as you might have heard last year, the ones against Putin and Lova Belova for the deportation of children to Russia from Ukraine. And beyond that, Ukraine is currently faced with over 120,000 investigations already. It is against this background crucial that third states also step in and open investigations. We are therefore, for example, supporting 2 survivors of the attack on the Mariupol Drama Theatre who want to seek accountability of perpetrators in submitting criminal complaints in Germany. And one recent positive example also concerns international crimes committed in Mariupol, namely in case of the killing of the Lithuanian filmmaker Mantas Kvedaravičius that some of you may have heard about in the beginning of the full-scale invasion, likely by Russian-backed so-called DNR forces. ECCHR is supporting the fiancé of the deceased in this case, and Lithuanian authorities have opened proceedings against 3 suspects. Now, it stands to be hoped that more states will open investigations into the attacks against the civilian population in Mariupol to hold those responsible to account. But these investigations can, of course, take a very long time, and it should be pointed out that it is not clear if the perpetrators can be apprehended in the long run. And we believe it is still important to preserve the evidence and issue arrest warrants because these crimes are not time-barred, and the likelihood that they are apprehended in the long run could be increased by this. At the same time, projects like the one presented here today by the Center for Spatial Technologies are crucial because they can already help to set the record straight or to explode the black box, as Maksym said in the beginning of his presentation, and give survivors a way to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation and for contributing with the some of the even quite recent changes that the ECCHR contributed to the study. And as I said, we will publish this on the website. But I just wanted to say one important thing, that for us it's been very important to not just be a database, right? To not just accumulate materials. As we were collaborating with different experts and with different scholars, we always felt like one way of looking at this is not enough. We always felt like, you know, there are limitations to each of these lenses through which we were looking. And all of the materials that we were amassing, we were frankly also slightly worried about the potential of just publishing them online as they are without explanation. So for that reason, it was very important for us to write a series of essays that basically weave all of these materials together in a meaningful way. And one of the authors who worked with us is Svetlana Matvienko, who's going to present the specific article that will also be published on the 16th of March.
Thank you very much, Maksym, and thanks, Isabel, for a wonderful presentation. So I'm happy to continue now with, again, offering you yet another take, yet another language and perspective on this case. So, and my language is, let's say, it's a philosophical take. So I'm a scholar of warfare, but I come from philosophy and communication studies. So the tasks that I set for myself is to, again, offer certain conceptual means to process, to think current wars, right? Because as we see all the time, that sometimes terms used either in legal sphere and other spheres remain kind of, they always a little bit behind. And war, unfortunately, develops and unfolds with a very different speed. So I work in a somewhat speculative dimension, but at the same time, the accuracy of interpretation and data collected, and especially the work with witnesses, is extremely important for my work. So again, I want to thank you very much to Maksym and the Center for Spatial Technologies, the amazing team who gave me the opportunity to think together about this case. And I want to thank Kyiv Perennial and for also inviting me to participate here and present my thoughts. And I will speak today about the notion that I'm developing, terror environment, in relation to the Mariupol theater of war. And we will begin with matter. The bombing of the Mariupol drama theater is an ultimate act of terror, but terror proliferated and continues proliferating beyond this act of violence. This presentation addresses some of the mechanisms and roots of its proliferation. Terror is ecological. It penetrates the networks of life-affirming connections to weaponize the organism's deep embeddedness in the environment. It invades the mechanisms supporting living body and turns them dangerous and even deadly. The material composition of terror environments is diverse. They are constituted by solid, liquid, and gaseous matter, from debris to pollution, moving at radically different speeds and in different directions. These environments are defined by sonic, olfactory, and thermal elements, from the wailing air alerts to punctuating explosions followed by shock waves, transferring energy at interfaces between tissues, producing that overall body's long memory of the shock that causes nearly unrecognizable slow destruction of life. Terror environments today also include a variety of informational objects, practices, and events from signal emission to jamming, instrumentalized to rupture or overturn initial communication, to psyops, propaganda, and random digital chaos often used to distort or control it. The subjects of war are caught in the complex materiality of the terror environments that they inhabit. It is crucial to consider how entangled all these material components of such environments are and how they interact by simultaneously impacting the behavior of the subjects of war. The perception of information, for example, does not happen in a vacuum. It is integrated in a network of existential material connections, from the sonic landscape that subjects inhabit to the quality of air they breathe, and probably to the freedom of movement they are granted or denied. The discrepancy between how frequently and successfully these aspects of terror environments are weaponized in military conflicts, and how poorly the crucial nuances of their aggression are accounted for by the law, opens the enormous possibilities for unpunishable violence. Constraint. War is a criminal act of aggression against citizens that is waged without the justification of self-defense and with the goal of territorial gain and subjugation. War is an industry of crimes that the International Criminal Court frames through the detailed system of laws of war. In the eyes of the law, there are limits to violence, or red lines, crossing which means committing a war crime. The topology of wars is that wars are crimes in themselves, different from war crimes, and at the same time, they contain war crimes. The bombing of the Mariupol theater by the Russian armed forces on March 16, 2022, is representative of such complexity. A premeditated and unlawful act of terrorism committed either by rebels or governments can be isolated, but it can also take place in the context of war. Terrorism is a form of warfare in which violence is directed towards civilians rather than the military. As historian Charles Tanchet writes, clearly war and terror are intimately related. However, the essence of terrorism, in contrast to war, he explains, is surely the negation of combat. its targets are attacked in a way that inhibits or prohibits self-defense. Warfare is a merciless stratification of population onto less and least protected. Terrorism, amid the war, acts precisely upon the weakest. It is drawn to the most defenseless realms. The absence of a military no-fly zone over the territory of Ukraine, for which Ukrainian lawmakers and politicians called on NATO from the first day on a large-scale invasion, gave the Russian Federation the green light to continue bombing Ukrainian cities and towns, so that Ukrainian civilians all over Ukraine are consistently targeted by incendiary weapons, cluster bombs, as well as cruise missiles, ballistic rockets, and drones at a long range. The degree of vulnerability of Mariupol in particular depends on these political decisions. Volume. Where the notion of territory remains crucial for reporting, analyzing, and narrativizing the war, the latter transgressed a traditional sense of two-dimensional territory at least a century ago. In the 80s, philosopher Paul Virilio described this change in warfare as a move from battlefield to a battle space, envisioned through the categories of distance, depth, and three-dimensionality. Space became a training ground for the dynamic offensive, for all the energies it harnessed. Drawing on Virilio, political scientist Stuart Eldon theorized a vertical dimension of territory, claiming that territory is a volume rather than the area. Philosopher Peter Sloterdijk went further to propose that the discovery of the environment took place in the trenches of World War I, referring to the practices of deploying gas as a weapon. To that end, he provocatively claimed the 20th century was shaped by the paradoxical convergence of the practice of terrorism with environmental thinking. Such environmental awareness is not prerogative to an aggressor only. It also characterizes the targeted subject entrapped by the war. In fact, it situates both an aggressor and a target in a deadly relation where they operate as part of a single assemblage. The aggressor aiming at suppressing by terror or eliminating the target entirely, and the target fighting for survival by any means available. The image produced by Maxar Technologies on March 14, 2022, demonstrates such a relation. The residents of the shelter in the theater drew the Russian word "дети" in two locations on the square outside the theater the very same day. The accuracy with which they determined the necessary size of the letters so they could be seen from a military airplane demonstrates that they were able to estimate the scope of the voluminous battle space they inhabited along with the aggressor. This awareness makes the temporary residents of the theater the subjects of war. The targeted subject of the battle space is split. Terror generates the impossibility of choosing an ultimate survival strategy. According to the witnesses, the sign was, of course, an attempt to identify the building to attacking forces as a civilian air raid shelter hosting children and not a military target. But at the same time, they were very much aware that this sign could actually entice the aggressor. And not that people really shared either that side or that side, but the split of the subjects of war is very important. The subject of war is constituted by the split by living these two possibilities at the same time. This typically identifies the general uncertainty and isolation between different survival strategies suggested by the group members who were trapped in this battle space. Routine. Although terror is typically associated in military and political theory with direct attacks, such bombing with attacks and bombing, understanding the war environmentally allows one to see how the terror environment persists after the direct attacks. And you probably already see in my presentation that I'm very much interested how this terror environment proliferates after the bombing. So what's happening, what it causes, what kind of conditions it poses, what possibilities for violence it opens in the months to come. In May 2022, the combat operations in the city were still ongoing at the Azovstal iron and steel works, where the Ukrainian armed forces held resistance for 80 years, until their surrender on March 16th. But already then, the cleanup of ruined buildings for the upcoming so-called reconstruction of the city began, often referred as to the creation of Russian New Potemkin village. The master plan of Mariupol reconstruction was developed and approved by the Ministry of Construction of Russia, together with the subordinate Unified Institute of Spatial Planning of the Russian Federation, and the decree was signed by the head of the so-called Donetsk Republic, Denis Pushilin, on July 30, 2022. The videos by pro-Russian bloggers obtained from their channels document the preparation for the realization of this incoming plan on the occupational reconstruction. The video from June 22 is representative of how the terror environment is structured under the conditions of so-called peace amid the war. The square, as we see it, is full of people who were drawn there by the occupational forces to receive a bag of so-called humanitarian aid. The line that is formed in a proximity to the ruins is long, and the crowd, especially and the crowded, and it's get even tighter, closer to the trucks with the aid. The square is packed with people. A woman in line speaks of being humiliating. All trucks have big screens installed on the side, transmitting the Russian news by the government-controlled channel Россия 1. We hear fragments of reports about the beginning of the fishing season in Kamchatka. Soon we hear the voice of the Russian most famous propagandist Vladimir Solovyov. The distant explosions are continuously heard in the background. A big power generator near the theater allows people to charge their phones, and we know that electricity is low and scarce. The practices that constitute the city routine on the square near the bombed theater are congruent in how they operate within the terror environment. Shortage of food supply, the obligatory experience of rotting matter under the ruins, the sound of explosions, the presence of military people, and propaganda. So all these are conditions, objects, and experiences that constitute this environment of terror on the central square. While the residents are waiting for the allowed portion of food, the screens mounted on the trucks proceed with propaganda. The Ukrainian internet providers are replaced by the Russian state-owned providers, and there is not enough electric power or elementary knowledge to run VPN. The combination of needs and experiences is an effective way of persuading, so-called persuading, the subject within the terror environment to submit to the occupational power. And then there is a concert. On September 10th, 2022, the day of the 79th anniversary of Mariupol's liberation from the Nazi occupation during World War II, the current pro-Russian occupational regime hosted a dual-purpose concert staged on the ruins of the drama theater. First, the event was used for indoctrination of citizens on a new status of Mariupol as a Russian city. And second, the concert served for content production to be broadcast to broader audiences on the occupational territories, featuring the state Kremlin Orchestra of Russia and Russian actor, people's artists Alexander Mikhailov, known for openly supporting so-called Lugansk and Donetsk republics along the with Russian invasion of Ukraine. The concert opened with the address from the head of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, Denis Pushilin, read by a representative, followed by another address by a deputy head of the Department of Presidential Affairs of the Russian Federation, Olga Lyakina, emphasizing the rootedness of the city in Russian culture. Russian music will be heard in Mariupol, in Russian Mariupol, they say. The concert featured the state Kremlin Orchestra performing Russian romantic composer Pyotr Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 4 in Fa minor, known for its appeal to the patriotic and heroic feelings, and described by music scholars as the apotheosis of imperial style. The overall mise-en-scene and the composition of the news episodes for television broadcast in the Russian Federation and the Russian-controlled occupied territories of Ukraine are rather straightforward, cutting from the scenes of the performance to the scenes of the audience or the representatives of the occupational government and back again, with occasional zooming in and out to show faces. These official news episodes construe the public event as an encounter between the audience of Mariupol residents, the Russian officials, and the representatives of so-called republics with Russian performance. The space they design is square, and the scenes of the ruined theater make the fourth component of such composition to serve as a perspective on the performance. The television viewer, thus, is led to believe that the four components of the space of this event, people under occupation, occupational government, patriotic graphomania, and imperial music, they are all brought back together and they are all in concert. And finally, screen. A close examination of various recordings of the concert reveal a more complex spatial organization of the event, allowing a glance behind the scene shown by the governmental controlled TV. The reconstructed street view around the drama theater demonstrates the full architecture of the event that deserves our attention. First of all, the broader picture reveals a different power dynamics and different groups of actors involved in this event, including apparently not one, but two audiences. A primary group of people, viewers seated in front of the stage, and a remote group of people, residents separated from the primary audience by the line of security guards and a wide cleared street space, but also by a fence. This video is recorded by a viewer from actually behind the fence. The reconstruction shifts our attention from the performance, as shown on TV, to the primary audience in front of the stage. They are at the center, and the event is indeed organized about them and around them. The remote audience, the second-order observers, watches the primary audience, the first-order observers, placed into a securitized perimeter in front of the ruin. The focus of attention is switched to how one looks instead of what one sees, or indeed the fact that one is capable of looking at all at the performance on this site of murder. A reconstructed street view shows a production scene. The subject of the terror environment is reproduced there to be immediately reified and mediatized as a content of propaganda. The topology of the media environment today is that a digital object travels the convoluted rules to multiple destinations simultaneously. So a Russian news episode for TV in fragments or as a whole also reaches Ukrainian viewer through social network, investigative or research project, or randomly, despite blockages on all sides. The encounter with this incredibly troubling performance for anyone in Ukraine is almost unavoidable. But so, what does it show? What does this episode, this video show? The people in front of the concert stage look at the camera or turn away. Some faces are relaxed or indifferent, others are tense. Some are laughing, others are annoyed by the camera gaze. It looks like some actually enjoy the verses. It seems that patriotic lines actually resonate with them, but then they look bored by Tchaikovsky. They listen to the officials, congratulating them on their liberation. They even seem to pay attention. In the end, this is a new regime, and whatever they think about it, pro, against, or indifferent, for them, the whole event is also a learning experience to some degree, at least for survival purposes. They are here, no way of easily getting out, and sometimes no will either, held by their surviving houses, the remains of community, by their gardens and graves. The proximity of their faces on the screens is deceiving. Zooming in doesn't bring the viewer closer, probably only further, due to the increasing opacity of mediation and the enforced narratives running over the footage. What do we see? What are we watching? This is just Russian TV.